Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
I am your other host, Stephen Falgu. Get Recc'd is our podcast that happens every so often.
That is
and we
currently
think,
streaming, it looks like. Yes, fantastic, great. Okay,
Okay.
please, we're going to start that again, okay? Everybody pretend this is the beginning. Hello, and welcome to Get Recc'd. I am your host, Louis Falgout.
I am your other host, Stephen Falgu. Get Recc'd is our occasional podcast. We've been away for a long time, so you probably forgot what it's about. Basically, I recommend something to Louis recommends something to me, and then we talk about it.
Awesome.
And we're actually here. We're actually live after the first attempt, which is right now.
We sat here for a little while trying to figure out this YouTube studio crap, because I always just used the original Creator Studio thing. And now this confused me a little bit, but I think we're good.
And we had a whole fun bit that everyone missed, and we can't repeat it because it's too late. You missed it.
It's like comedy. It flows with the weather. It flows with the wind. It's there and then it's gone. If you're not able to capture that energy, if you're not able to capture that spirit, you'll never say anything funny in your life. So there's some good advice.
Yeah, and that's why comedians, when they go on tour, literally every show they do is completely different.
Yeah.
They never repeat any jokes.
Of course
it's crazy.
Not. Yeah.
But anyway, we have been gone for a long time. So, Louis, in all that time that we've been gone, how have you been?
I've been great. We went on a thing that was cool. It was a vacation away from Get Recc'd. It's called a sabbatical. This was the joke we did. It was really funny. Steven, what was your sabbatical? I turned it around on you because he did it to me the first time. You see, it's comedy.
Yeah, it was good, but again, that's all in the past, so we can't. So that was just a flavor for everyone. If you were curious what the joke could have been, that could have been the joke you heard.
And I'm sure you're really upset you missed it. But sorry.
Thank you, Alphabet Company, for making everyone in our audience miss our wonderful jokes. So thank you, YouTube. Yeah. We appreciate you. Well, with that, Louis, I guess because we can't have any jokes on this one, do you want to jump right into what you recommended to me?
Yes, and it's not funny at all. Steven, I recommended to you the album Images and Words by progressive metal band Dream Theater. The only reason I recommended this to you is because I felt that our podcast was sorely lacking some progressive metal. And now we are no longer lacking progressive metal. So with that, Steven, I will allow you the room to speak.
Okay, so I'm going to bring back an old faithful and go ahead and say that I've never heard of this before. Dream Theater had escaped me somehow, so it was interesting to even jump into this. I don't know if I've even ever listened to anything that I would consider to be progressive metal. I've definitely listened to things that would be considered progressive rock. So even jumping into the genre, I was kind of not necessarily sure what that meant or where it was going to go. And I will say, I don't know if this album helped me learn what that genre is. Because in the first track, I could see where this album differentiated from what I guess I would consider progressive rock. But then after the first track, well, just in general, like from track 1 to the rest of the tracks, there's this odd thing that happens where, and again, I always say this because I always feel like it could be a function of technology. But first of all, the first track just kind of cut off. Like it just cuts off. Like it doesn't like end, it doesn't gradually end, it just kind of stops. And again, that could either be on purpose or it could just be a function of how I was listening to it. And then the follow-up tracks, a lot of them feel very progressive rock to me. And a lot of them feel very glam rock to me as well. Like big, basically it goes from this track that is a little harder in track 1 to basically like a rock ballad, like a love ballad that you would hear in like the radio and definitely like the 80s, that time frame. And then it kind of, it changes from there. But I think just the track 1 to the track 2, that contrast was so strange to me. And from then on, from like track 2 through the end of this thing, it definitely felt a lot like it felt to me like the prog rock genre. Like I felt all of that influence. So I guess, Lewis, one question I would have is like, what would you say defines prog metal, and what about this is that?
Prog metal is defined by being trash, and prog rock is defined by being, I don't know. I mean, well, it depends. I mean, it depends on the band you're talking about. Like, I don't know if you know Tool is another popular progressive metal band, or Opeth or something. I guess the band you're talking about it changes, but in the same way, prog rock features complex song structures with odd time signatures and generally longer songs, sometimes conceptual albums, grander, more fantastical concepts lyrically, all that kind of thing you associate with prog rock. Take that and apply it to metal. That's what prog metal is, basically. And so you'll hear on a lot of the longer tracks in this album, the more heavier tracks in this album, there's like odd time signatures, a bunch of like instrumental fuckery, to show off how good they can all play their instruments. I'm sure you noticed a lot of that. What many
Yeah.
people would call wanking, musical wanking. That's kind of a thing. But I think like this album is pretty soft for a metal album. Then again, some prog metal tends to be. But things like the guitar tone, the heaviness of the drums, the singer's, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? The thing is, I would say inclination towards like power metal kind of soaring vocals. You touched on how like stuff like Another Day sounds like rock ballads from the 80s, but if you think like a lot of those rock ballads came from glam metal bands, and I would say that Dream Theater is probably closer to like glam metal and power metal than some other prog metal bands who might be closer to other things. And then of course there's like stuff like technical death metal, which I guess you could say is similar to this, but obviously a lot heavier. I mean, sometimes the distinctions between metal and rock can become a little blurry, like what's the difference between like glam metal and hard rock? Sometimes it's kind of hard to tell. And so I can kind of see the confusion there. But I think like generally you'll notice the guitar tone is like a metal guitar tone and other things like that.
Gotcha. Okay, so I guess to talk about this album, I don't know if I really vibed with this one that much, to be honest. And I didn't hate it necessarily, but I felt like so much of it was just kind of fluff. Like especially Another Day, and there were one or two other tracks here that just felt so kind of fluffy. Reminded me of that kind of glam metal sound that I already talked about and that you mentioned. I was with this album on the first track for sure. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then there's one or two other ones here that I liked, like Metropolis. But for the most part, this either it gets weirdly slow and super glammy, or it's just very long interludes of random instruments, but I wouldn't call them like very instrumental.
Well, it's certainly not very interestingly composed. You'll get like long extended instrumental sections, of course, as is given with prog metal, where they'll play in like really complex time signatures. And if you play guitar, if you play synth, if you play bass, if you play drums, you can say, "Wow, that's impressive." And that's about the only thought you're gonna have while listening to these parts. No, I mean, Dream Theater's kind of trash. I mean, the thing is, like, I one time saw somebody say, I wish I could give this person credit. I'm sure many people have said this, but people sometimes call Dream Theater the Kenny G of metal. And I think.
Yeah. I vibe with that.
That's pretty appropriate.
I get that.
There are, like, it's funny with this album, too, like, it's an 8-track album. I mean, it's a pretty long album, but, only 8 songs here. It's pretty cut down in terms of, like, a bunch of songs. And yet they still feel the need to include, like, at least 2. No, there are, like, 3, like, ballads on this album. Like, really corny ballads across this album. Like, Another Day and Surrounded and Under a Glass Moon, I think, is the other one. And it's, like, I can get the idea, of course, behind separating your long epic prog metal tracks with softer songs. That's a very tried and true track listing method. But when your softer songs are literally just corny ballads that, yeah, they would have fit in like with, I don't know, fucking what's that Poison song? I don't know. You know the Poison song, right? The Poison.
Every rose has its
yeah,
thorn.
yeah. You could put like Another Day right up against that, and what's the difference? I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And it might be because of the length of the tracks, but I feel like, at least in my headspace, this thing is dominated by those. Like I understand that they are like the majority of this is not that, but that just stuck out to me so much that it weighed down my entire impression of the album, especially Another Day. Like that 1 to 2 track transition in the like literally the first 2 tracks, I was like, what in the world just happened?
Yeah, it would have been. I think these songs are pretty bad anyway. I don't and extremely corny. Then again, almost everything on this album is, but we'll get to that, I guess. But like, I. But if it's gonna be on the album, I would say like at the very least, I think your first 2 tracks should both be metal tracks. Or maybe your second track is like a really short interlude. That could be fine. But like putting the ballad as track 2 on your 8-track prog metal album is like a really weird choice, because it's not just the opening track that sets you up for the expectation of what an album's going to be. I would say it's generally track 2 as well, right? And I mean, I guess it's fair that since this album does have some balladry on it, you want to set that up. But Another Day is like the most ballad on this album, and it's just a very, very bad track 2.
Yeah, I like doing this thing. I just want to preface this, and I think this is true for you too, Lewis, but I don't know if the audience knows this or not, but not only do we not give our impressions of whatever we recommend to each other, I at least don't even look up impressions of the thing at all until pretty much right this second. If I ever do, period. But often I pull up the Wikipedia page to follow the track listings when we're talking about albums, and I like to see how these things are ranked by critics. And holy God, like I can't even imagine a world where this thing has won as many awards as it has.
Yeah.
Like metal, here's some snippets. So Metal Storm, the review source, gave it a 9.6 out of 10. Rock Hard gave it a 10 out of 10. It was number 95 on Rolling Stone's 100 Greatest Metal Albums of All Time. Images and Words was ranked number 7 on Guitar World magazine's top 10 list of guitar albums.
Well, that's, I guess, slightly more understood. No. No, I can't. No, I didn't make this clear to you, but Images and Words is considered like a prog metal classic. And in circles that consider themselves prog fans nowadays, they tend to just blend prog metal and prog rock all into one and just call it all prog. And in those circles, this would be called a prog classic. Like, this album is heralded really highly. Although I would say that Dream Theater definitely has a pretty substantial hate train. But it is true that they are an acclaimed band, and this album is an acclaimed album. And I really, really fail to understand it, because not only... I mean, I guess some people are more into power metal than I am, but the thing is, a lot of prog metal bands, particularly Dream Theater, take a lot from power metal, and... you hear that in the anthemic, soaring, and corny choruses and vocals all across this album. All of the epic moments. There's a very strong fixation on trying to be epic, I think, on this album, which is fair. It's a prog album, I suppose. But all of those elements do come from power metal. It's another thing that I would say softens this sound from something like Tool, which is more fixated towards alternative metal. And for that reason, I think this album just comes across as, when it doesn't come across as just really plain and passé, it comes across as just incredibly cheesy. I mean, all of it does. One of the main production elements here is programmed drums. You'll notice the drums sound almost like electronic drums on a lot of tracks. Like the reverb on them is so insane. It's because they're programmed drums, and they just sound so cheesy. It's a problem that plagues the record, I think, even on the best tracks here. And I will give credit to some tracks, but even on the best tracks here, I think this is a problem that kind of carries through. And I guess if that's something you can overlook, then, you know, I guess this is amazing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think for me, well, first of all, I don't want to give the wrong impression. I didn't hate this thing necessarily. To me, it was just kind of blasé at best, just kind of mediocre. So that's mainly where the accolade surprise comes for me. Not that I hate it, but the other thing is I wanted to mention, as far as tracks that I liked, I do like "Pull Me Under," although I do think it, again, I don't know if it's a part of the track or not, but that it just kind of stops was pretty weird, kind of jarring. And the other one that I liked was Metropolis. But other
Those
than
those are the
other
two
than
songs
that,
I like as well. Yeah.
yeah. Other than that, I felt most of the tracks were either like way over the top, like Another Day, or just kind of generally forgettable. I know, for instance, one track, I want to say it's either Under a Glass Moon or Learning to Live. They're very long tracks, and just so much of it became this musical interlude that I didn't really feel like had any purpose or really brought out anything to the track. That it felt like a lot of this album just kind of was that way to me.
Yeah, it does a lot of the time feel like the noodling on this album just isn't like good. I mean, it's like it's impressive, but it's not really good. I don't think the band generally does a great job on some of these songs of maintaining the quality of the lyrical sections. And that's when the lyrical sections are good. But even if they're not, like when they go to the instrumental sections, it always just feels like, okay, here's the part where they're going to show off to me. And like, of all of the great prog rock bands, like classic prog bands from the late 60s to the 70s, I don't really feel that way for any of them. I think whenever they did long instrumental sections, and of course all of them did, it was because they were actually musically interesting. Now, of course, there are bands who sucked, sure, but Dream Theater falls more in line with those bands who sucked, who just ended up being really wanky. As opposed to the bands that were great. But I will say, and you mentioned these two songs, "Pull Me Under" is a great song, really anthemic. It's got a great chorus, and I think it's a song that really carries itself through the entire way. I don't feel like there's a moment on that thing that feels wasted. And then I would say that Metropolis Part 1 is like actually amazing. Like that to me, if Dream Theater were like that all the time, I would actually love them. Because the instrumental noodling on that track is actually fantastic the whole time. And that song has this epic atmosphere to it and some really soaring moments that come out with great build-ups and lead-ins. It is just a stellar track. But like, other than that, like the other prog metal tracks here, I might be missing one, but I think Take the Time and Learning to Live are the other two I would categorize in this same category. Unless I'm forgetting another one that kind of is. But like these two songs are just, they have so many weak moments all across their runtime. Take the Time in the beginning starts off like fucking horrible. It gets a little better, but neither of these songs I think really work in the way Pull Me Under or Metropolis Part 1 do.
Yeah, I agree. And it's no surprise that Pull Me Under and Metropolis, I believe, were singles, and then Another Day was also a single, which is just like, but again, it's 1992 and people are like, yeah, every rose has its thorn.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they were like all about it.
I'm not sure if this was before or after grunge really hit. It depends on the time in 1992. Because I think, I mean, I know Nevermind came out in 91, but I think grunge like really took over popular consciousness this year, right, in 92. And if that's the case, I would be curious because this feels like an extension of hair metal, doesn't it? Like,
oh yeah, for sure.
Just more progressive, but yeah, it definitely does.
And I'm looking on Wikipedia, and Another Day was not even released as a single until 1993. So a whole another year after.
Yeah, they were
date.
just riding that grunge wave. You know, everyone listening to Nirvana and Alice in Chains and fucking Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, whatever. That's the time we release Another Day. That's when this is really gonna land with.
Yeah, because then it's nostalgic.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really missed this for 1 year.
The greatest generation can say, "Oh, see, that's my music."
Yeah, true.
Not of all of this Washington trash.
Yeah. Yeah, well, you know. But it is like, I don't know. I guess I don't know how kind time has been to Dream Theater either. They have a very passionate fan base. They do, like, incredibly passionate fan base.
Yeah, well, they in April 2013, Loudwire fan voted them March Metal Madness best album of all time. So there, you got that.
For images and words.
Yeah, best metal album of all time.
Mm.
2013.
Best metal album of all time. Well, anyway, but I don't know. I see the appeal to some extent, but I feel like this album just isn't even that well put together. Like, even if I can get past my own personal shortcomings with it, and I think you touched on that as well, so it seems like we're pretty much in agreement.
Yeah. Have anything else to say on this one, Lewis?
No, I think you can wrap it up.
Okay, well, in that case, as I mentioned, I don't hate this thing necessarily. I think I might have inadvertently come off a little too harsh on this thing. Like, it's fine. There are tracks that I like, but for the most part, I kind of find it mediocre at best. So with that, I'd probably give it just squarely right around a 5, honestly. The tracks that I do like, I actually did like quite a bit, but I feel like they are such a small portion of this album, and it transitions so quickly into something that I did not enjoy all that much that it's hard to really see that giving it much more than anything other than kind of right in the middle. And I don't think I would recommend this necessarily.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give this a 4. I'll go one step below because I would say this is a bad album. Like, this is an album that I think about and I think of like moldy cheese. Like, I don't know. I don't really want to listen to this anytime. There are great tracks on this, and I mean, for sure, it's a prog metal classic. It's not really up to me to decide, and I don't like this genre anyway. I haven't explored it a ton, and maybe with some more exploration, I could find some more great bands. But like some of the best bands in this genre, like Dream Theater, and I don't really like Tool that much. And Tool's definitely better, but. And so on and so forth. And a lot of these bands to me just feel like they take, you know how like people who hate prog will say it's like, it's just people like jerking off on their instruments or whatever and like just playing crazy stuff for the sake of it or whatever. I think that characterization is completely false when you're talking about prog rock. I mean, it isn't untrue with literally every band, but with a lot of the classic bands, that is completely wrong. There was so much more to it than that. But prog metal, I mean, so few of these bands that I've heard really bring much more to the table than that. And I mean, it might be better if you're a classically trained musician to listen to this, because there's definitely a lot of great stuff going on here in terms of like actual technical skill. But other than that, I just don't think there's much to it. No, I wouldn't recommend it. Even if you're looking for prog metal, I would probably give you other things first, just because I know I don't like this. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So do we want to move on to what you recommended to me, Steven?
Yes. So, Lewis, just as you felt like we were missing prog metal, I felt like there was a hole, because within the last couple of years, we've had basically 2 large, sometimes even 3 large film superhero blockbusters. And this year, we only had 2. And I was missing that third superhero blockbuster. And what better third superhero blockbuster is there out there in the world than Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3?
And I have to agree with that assertion. In fact, we can go ahead and wrap it up. This film is incredible. It's easily the greatest superhero film of all time. I mean, look at the poster. He's like turning evil. It's pretty epic.
So thank you, everyone, for listening to our podcast. This has been Get Recc'd.
So, Steven, what do you have to recommend to me? Anyway. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. This is, okay. So, I haven't seen Spider-Man 2 in my life. I've seen.
Oh, so that really puts this in an interesting.
It was interesting. I have seen Spider-Man 1, although I think it was played on like Cartoon Network, and I was watching it on TV when I was like a kid. I don't know much about these Sam Raimi movies.
So they like censored out the one PG joke where they said ass.
Probably, yeah. They can't say the A word. Spider-Man said the A word on Cartoon Network. I don't know, but yeah, it's like what I understand about these films, and it's something I understand about Sam Raimi from the little I've seen of him as well, is that, you know, there's kind of an intentional corniness in these movies, an intentional awkwardness, and it's definitely watching this film. It's definitely interesting because, like, compared to the superhero movies of like today's Marvel era, that's sort of like Iron Man, this is like a weird beast. And I know Spider-Man 3 in particular is particularly weird. I get that, but like. Even what I remember and know of the other 2 films, like, it does just feel like such a relic of the 2000s. Like, could comic book movies quite like this exist today? Maybe. I mean, I understand that there have been some films lately that have tried to capitalize on this similar thing. But this was like, am I incorrect to say that this was like the superhero trilogy of the 2000s? It was, right? Like the biggest superhero films.
Yeah, I would say this and X-Men.
Oh, and X-Men. That's right, X-Men as well. Yeah. But I mean, still, this is like one of the only ones, as opposed to now where it's really oversaturated. So
yeah. Make no mistake, and I don't know off the top of my head exactly which came first, either Spider-Man or X-Men, but those films really reinvigorated the superhero film genre and really defined the superhero film genre for the 2000s and even slowly going into the 2010s, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Because you think about this time for superhero films, because it was Spider-Man, it was X-Men, then it was all these other ones that basically tried to emulate Spider-Man. Like there was a Daredevil one that was really bad, and then Batman came on the scene, and Catwoman, and because really before that you have the Batman, like Burton films, and some other superhero films like Superman and such. But these really defined kind of what like the edgy new wave superhero movie.
And of course, we did talk about the Dark Knight trilogy prior to this, which was probably the next major one, because I mean, Batman Begins came out the same year. No, came out a year before this. But I know Dark Knight was 2009 or 2008 or something. So it was around similar time frame there, and I think that series probably defined modern day superhero films more than this does. I think. Well, certainly the darker stuff. I would not define the Spider-Man movie as dark. It's really corny, and I know Sam Raimi does that intentionally. And you can definitely see a lot of these scenes. There was like a very like, it was like trying to make itself really goofy. But this movie just went overboard in that department. Like there are scenes in this movie that like I couldn't even believe. Like it gets so ridiculous. It's I don't even know if it's funny, but it's like it's something. Like I was watching that scene in the jazz club, and I can definitely say I was watching a film at that moment. It's like it's confounding. Like, oh my, some of the like dark Spider-Man stuff in this movie is some of the most bizarre things like I've ever seen from a mainstream movie, certainly mainstream superhero movie.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to jump around quite a bit on this one, but I specifically want to talk about that because everyone remembers the Tobey Maguire walking down the street dancing. But I would argue that jazz club scene is the most bizarre thing I have seen in a superhero movie, hands down.
Yeah, I would agree.
Like, it is just almost unbelievable that I was even watching this. Also, that I had forgotten that Bryce Dallas Howard was in this movie. That was also kind of weird for me on the rewatch. But that whole scene was just a trip.
I mean, it's like... there's a couple reasons why it's so weird. I mean, it's incredibly weird out of context. It's incredibly weird in context. I mean, I'll get to some of the reasons why that is. Like, I think there's actually a pretty specific reason why that stuff, the stuff that people kind of talk about, which is namely the sidewalk scene. I mean, which is really bad as well and really weird as well, but not nearly as much. But I think there's a reason why this film makes those scenes seem so out of place. I mean, they're weird on their own, but and I guess I'll just get into it because this is my main point about this whole film is that the pacing of this movie is so bad. Like, this movie tries to juggle so many things at once, and it has no idea how and when to show these different plot lines. The movie just becomes such a mess, like within, God, at least within the first like 20 minutes, maybe even. It's just like, oh my God, like how many things are going to be in this movie? And this dark Spider-Man suit basically comes out of nowhere. I mean, it's introduced earlier in the film where you see a meteorite and you see some black goo come out, but then it just isn't, it's like forgotten about for like, God, almost an hour. And then out of nowhere, it just shows up. and Spider-Man's just in a black suit, and you don't even know what it does. It doesn't even establish what the suit like does to him for a couple scenes. And so you get right into this Dark Spider-Man stuff like at a weird point in the movie where other plot lines aren't even that well underway yet, really. Or they're kind of like in midway through. And then you get into these scenes where he's dancing on the sidewalk and like going nuts in a jazz club. And it's just like, what the fuck? Because, you know, the main storyline here, I would say the main one, and I don't know what the intention was, but it seems like the main story is the Sandman. Because he's focused on in the earliest section of the movie. And he's like, he's the man who killed Spider-Man. Spoilers, whatever. He's the man who killed Spider-Man's Uncle Ben.
Which is such a weird thing, because they very clearly define who the person is that kills Uncle Ben in another movie, and then essentially retcon it just to give Sandman some extra weight in this movie. But then they don't even make him really the main villain.
Yeah. Well, like, he is for a little bit. Yeah, and then it's like, and then there's just 3 villains, and it's just like, oh, okay. I mean, at a point in this movie, there's like 4, if you count Dark Spider-Man. There's like a section of this movie where there are like 4 antagonists. But yeah, so anyway, the Sandman is probably the most compelling thing here, I would say, because there are a couple of scenes with him that come close to working. I understand that's not very high praise, but, you know, we're talking about Spider-Man 3. But there are a few scenes where I feel like his motivation, aside from him retconning whatever else, like his motivation and how he killed Uncle Ben and everything feels pretty good. It's pretty compelling. There's a pretty good scene with it at one point that starts off good anyway. The problem is, though, that this, I would say, is probably the most interesting thing that is in this film. The stuff with Harry isn't so bad, but it's just so damn goofy. I couldn't take it seriously. So Sandman's probably the best this movie's got. And, like, really think, how much of Sandman is actually in this movie compared to all the other bullshit? Like, Sandman just straight up disappears for lengthy periods of time. And when he shows up at the final climax with everybody, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Like, that's how I felt. The movie just forgets about him all the time in favor of these other things. The other things being Harry, who is the son of the Green Goblin, right? The Green Goblin?
Yeah.
And he hates Spider-Man because he thinks Spider-Man killed his dad. And so there's also like a love triangle that kind of starts to happen between him, Toby, did I almost just say? Never mind. Spider-Man and Lois Lane. Or Lois Lane? Shit. No. Lois Lane, Superman. Mary Jane.
Mary Jane.
Whatever. And so that starts to develop as well, which, by the way, means there's another subplot going on. And that Mary Jane stuff is like a lot of this movie as well. And I understand that everything I've been saying right here, I've been jumping all over the place, but I mean, that's pretty fitting because that's what watching this movie feels like. I can't even piece together like a flow chart in my brain of how to tackle all these subjects because the movie just throws them all in there and blends them up in this weird way. Like, scene transitions are jarring where like you remember something was going on that you forgot about because the movie forgot about it. It's just really fucking weird.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Like, if you were to put each of the individual subplots, to which there are a ridiculous number, like, for instance, they introduced George Stacy and Gwen Stacy in this movie for seemingly no reason, don't really give them any weight necessarily. They're there, they kind of disrupt Peter's life, and then they're basically forgotten about. If you were to put each of these subplots and try to, like, map them horizontally, like taking out the jumps between them, I don't even think like they're solid connections. It's like the movie's like, hey, look at this guy. It's Sandman. He's got a kid. That's important. He was in prison. That's important. Okay, forget about him for like, I don't know, probably 30 minutes. We'll get back to him later. Okay. Oh, look, now he's like in a thing and his molecules are being disrupted, which happens to be in a swamp, and there are people chasing him, and you would think they would be informed or something.
And the scientists recognize something entered their machine, but they're like, whatever.
It's a bird, it'll fly away.
Yeah.
Gosh, yeah, there's so much. It feels like to me, all right, so the thing is, like, the first movie was very much the origin story, really kind of set the Green Goblin as the villain, and the relationships between Peter and Mary Jane and Harry's dad, Norman. The second movie kind of gets more towards focusing on Doc Ock, which was really interesting, and kind of Peter as he's becoming more adept at being Spider-Man, and then obviously Norman comes back into the picture. It just feels like this movie tried to close that trilogy out very neatly by finally focusing on then Harry and Peter's relationship and what all of that meant for Harry and Peter. And you do kind of get that tied up in this movie, but it's so entangled in all of this other mess that it feels like it would have just been so much cleaner. It really feels like, honestly, and I 100% believe that this was absolutely the case, this movie was going to be about Harry and probably the Sandman. And then producer credits were like, no, we got to expand this universe, get Venom in there, get Gwen Stacy in there, get this and that in there, because we need it all so that way we can have so many more movies and all this stuff. And it just becomes so bogged down in all of this mess.
Yeah, because I was going to say, and I'm glad that you thought this. I thought we might have had a different take on this. I agree that this movie feels like it actually could have worked pretty well if it were Harry. It were the story with Harry, which would have been the main plot, and then a subplot with the Sandman. I mean, the movie's like a little over 2 hours long. It definitely had time for both of those things. And whenever it makes times for both of those things, I think those are some of the better scenes in the film. I think the thing that really throws a wrench in this, and it's funny because this is what the movie was like marketed as, this is like the sole marketing push, is the Dark Spider-Man and Venom stuff. Like, it's just so weird. It's so out of place. It's so sudden. I mean, like I said, this element of the film just shows up at one point, like all of a sudden. And it tangles everything else up to the point where, like, now the story with Peter Parker and, I almost said Lois Lane again, and Mary Jane and Harry and all this stuff gets like additionally complicated because now there's like a new Peter Parker who's showing up, who's confusing everyone. But then, like, not only that, but then you also get the Venom stuff with the other photographer who, he's barely even in the movie before this point. He's just kind of there sometimes. And now he's like a main villain. And then this final sequence becomes such a mess. It's just like, I mean, it's good that they got Harry to like come and join Spider-Man here. I think that was good to at least give it some more focus. But it was like, why would, like, the Sandman and Venom teaming up was just such a dumb thing. It was another thing, by the way, that came out of nowhere. Like, suddenly there's just jarring scene transition, and then Venom's like, I want to kill Spider-Man, you want to kill Spider-Man. And then they team up to kill Spider-Man. I don't know. Like, it's like they should have just picked two things. Two things would have been fine, I think. I think the movie was long enough for that. I understand you want to have a big epic fight at the end, whatever. Two things would have been enough, I think.
I don't know if this is a hot take anymore at this point, but I don't really think I ever entirely enjoyed any of the Raimi Spider-Man films. I feel like, just as a very large Spider-Man fan, they did some things with Spider-Man that never really made sense to me. Plus, these actors are definitely like in their 20s and 30s, and they're still trying to pretend to be high schoolers, which I just find very funny. At least in this one, they're like in college, so it's at least a little bit more believable. But they always looked exactly the same, even in the first one where they're supposed to be like sophomores. But with all that being said, there are some things that I do like in this movie. One, J. Jonah Jameson, J.K. Simmons was made to play that character.
Yeah.
And I am so glad that they are bringing him back. I don't know if that's a spoiler or not, but they are bringing him back as that character because he is so good in that role. Even in this one, the way that he just can intentionally ham it up as that character is perfect. Every time he's on the screen, I just get such a kick out of that.
And
Other than that,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, other than that, I don't feel like necessarily any of these performances are terrible. Kirsten Dunst, Tobey Maguire, I feel like for the most part they're pretty flat. Topher Grace is such a weird character, but I don't think that was any fault of the actor. And James Franco does a good job as Harry. But for the most part, like, none of these performances are necessarily stellar, nor do I feel like any of these performances really embody the characters that they're even supposed to be playing. And to that point, just in general with this trilogy, as we get into this third film, I feel like so many of these characters' motivations and development up until this point is thrown out the window. And I think it all came to a head to me in the scene where, and you could chalk this up maybe to Peter having embraced the symbiote a little bit, but when he kind of like feels all the fame and the glory and he's up on stage and he's like, yeah, Gwen, kiss me, it'll be great, the audience will love it. It's like, what? Who is that? Like, nothing even in this film would suggest that he would have done that. Like, he was so in love with Mary Jane, and there's this whole like almost sitcom like trying to propose to her at the right time. And then out of nowhere, he like asks Gwen Stacy to kiss him in front of this giant audience where Mary Jane is like clearly there, like he knows she's there. It makes no sense.
That's what I was gonna say. That scene is so bad because like it went out of its way to establish that he knew that Mary Jane was there. He like literally just talked to her and told her, "Hey, watch me. I'm gonna come swinging." It's like, are you? And then like after this, he almost doesn't even like seem to be aware he did it. And he didn't have. I don't think he had the symbiote yet in that scene. No, he didn't. He didn't have it. It's like. It was the weirdest thing, and yeah, it was a character motivation that made no sense. But I mean, it was just a really dumb scene.
The other thing I wanted to mention quickly, because I would be curious. So one, I have this theory that producers probably forced them to add more characters into this thing. But as a way to write that out, I'm kind of curious whether the whole Harry getting amnesia thing was literally so that way they could add more screen time for everything else to be established, because it's thrown away so quickly. Like literally nothing triggers him coming back from amnesia. He's just like, oh yeah, that's right, I gotta kill Spider-Man, he killed my dad.
Yeah, like well, what happens is he kisses Mary Jane, but it's like, how would that make you hate Peter Parker? I don't even like, he kisses Mary Jane and she's like, oh god, I gotta leave. It's like, what? I was so confused. Like, why the hell is that the part where he's like, oh my god, it all came back to me now? Like, what? I don't know. Yeah, so something I wanted to say about the actors that you mentioned, and I don't know about the whole trilogy, but again, I was talking about how Sam Raimi makes these films intentionally corny. He does that in all of his movies, as far as I'm aware. At least all the ones that I know of. I think, given his directorial intentions, I think these casting choices all make sense, honestly. I think that these characters and actors come across as really dopey, and that's not even an offense to any of them. I'm not saying they would in any other case, but it seems to be, to me anyway, to be exactly what Sam Raimi wanted out of them, and I can almost appreciate that. I would have to see Spider-Man 1 or 2 to really say, because this movie is just such a bad movie that it comes across as just being annoying, corny, as opposed to like fun. But I could see that being a fun and entertaining element to the other movies. Because there are moments in this film where it almost worked. It's just that it went overboard in some scenes and didn't really, like... Again, it just wasn't a very compelling story on its own. So anyway. Let's see. The last thing, or one of the last things I wanted to mention before I forget. The Sandman stuff in this movie I'm really torn on. Because, like I said, it's I think it's the most compelling stuff that was in this movie. But... I couldn't decide if some of these scenes were really good or really dumb. Like, there's the CGI sequence where the Sandman comes into being. It's after he was turned into, like, I don't know, his molecules got turned into sand because some sand went into his bloodstream. That makes sense. But anyway, he turns into sand. You have this sequence where he forms back into his human form slowly. And there's some really nice music to this sequence. It was almost beautiful, and it was almost hilarious. And I don't know which one it was more. And then there was another sequence similar to this at the very end of the film where he gets forgiven by Spider-Man, which I thought was a nice scene, where he really put his motivation to light. It was okay. And then he turns into sand and flies away in the wind. And I don't know if the movie's implying he died because forgiveness was all he needed or something. I don't know. I don't know if that was corny or beautiful. This was the one thing I think I was the most torn on that I almost wanted to like, but I have no idea if I did.
Can we talk about the visual effect? Like right after his matter gets dematerialized or whatever, and it's like these big rocks, and they're rolling and they're rolling, and then this camera zooming out, and it was sand, and then it turns into the guy.
Yeah.
Because I cracked up at that. This big reveal that the rocks were sand the whole time.
Wow. He's the Sandman.
So I'm reading some things about the development from this Wikipedia article, and basically every theory that I have sounds like it was exactly correct.
Nice.
So they were talking, apparently Raimi has come out to say that this movie was about Peter, Mary Jane, Harry, and the Sandman, and of Peter's journey being one of forgiveness. Apparently Avi Arad, who at the time owned Marvel, wanted them to include Venom and Gwen Stacy, so the producer noted that. And because they were planning a Venom spin-off.
Hey, that eventually came to fruition.
Yeah, and apparently the Venom spin-off that we got was a fruition of that Venom spin-off, so
Beautiful.
I will say, going back to this movie after having what I think is literally a perfect Spider-Man on film, the MCU portrayal by Tom Holland and the Marvel movies that we have between Spider-Man Homecoming and Far From Home, and then also his portrayal in the other MCU movies. It's weird to go back to this one because it is such a different beast. First of all, just in general, and I think you mentioned at the top, like this style of superhero movie was such a time and place superhero film, and I feel like superhero films just in general have kind of progressed from this very like weirdly serious but not tone to now they've become very jokey in a way that probably has swung the pendulum too far. But even looking at the character of Spider-Man, I think that on both sides, Peter Parker and Spider-Man, they've just been able to do so much more with both of those characters and matured both of those characters in a way on screen and in writing through the MCU and through other places. I would even say as much flack as the Amazing Spider-Man gets, and especially Amazing Spider-Man 2, I felt like even that was a progression from what this Spider-Man is to something more similar to, I wouldn't even say to the comics necessarily, but to its own character. And now they've been able to do that even more so with the MCU treatments. That going back to this is really interesting to just see like all the direction and all of the elements that they chose to retain from the comic storylines and from the other films in the series, and then also just kind of blowing it over the top when he becomes Venom and all this stuff. It was just an interesting look back at kind of what was the genesis of what we have now, which is the super influx of superhero movies. This one particularly, I think, is like it gets an understandable bad rap. And what's interesting about it is I don't even know if I would say that this one is so bad that it was fun to watch, but it was very hilarious in certain parts. And I don't think it was supposed to be, but I think that makes it even better.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's supposed to be a like I can tell, and I guess it's just because I mean I know what Sam Raimi does. Like I can tell that this is supposed to be dumb a lot of the time, it fails to balance that tone a lot. But like the stuff with like Spider-Man dancing and the jazz club scene, I mean, it was definitely supposed to be like silly and goofy and dumb. It's just that it comes across so oddly like alien, that like it doesn't come through. Where you're just like, what? As
Yeah,
opposed to
well, I
laughing
think
along with the movie.
I think some additional context that I have that you might not have, Lewis, is actually Spider-Man 2 is very serious. Like, it is played for a very serious tone. The interaction between Peter and Norman and Doc Ock, it's no laughs. It's all very dark, very serious, very introspective, very much what you would think of like with like the Batman trilogy, like that Dark Knight trilogy sort of thing. And then they went here. So that's why I think there is a little bit of additional context that you get just from understanding the first two films that makes this one even more extremely out there.
Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So
Yeah, because it seems like this movie is like pervasively corny, and yeah.
and I think that's why people make fun of those scenes that you talk about so much, Lewis, like the jazz club scene and him walking down the street, is it's like this movie is going for a dark tone. And whereas the MCU movies, like superhero movies now, like there's an understanding that they're going to be jokey, but the jokes are going to land because there's like kind of this subversion. Whereas like this is jokey and like oddball and over the top in a way where it's like, is this supposed to be funny?
Yeah.
Like, am I supposed to be laughing at him walking down the street?
Yeah, it's confusing.
And
Yeah.
the way that he's like dancing down the street and when he bumps into a girl and she like looks back like, ooh, who is that? He has his hair down a little bit and doing a dance.
Emo Spider-Man.
Yeah, I know. That was my favorite part. Where he's and then when Brock is like, no, man, you can't tell them it was all a fake. You'll ruin my career. And he's like, yeah, I will. And then
yeah. Oh my god, that part where he like fucking like playground fights with the photographer in the workplace. Oh my god, that was great. Yeah, but anyway, I'm ready to wrap it up. I don't know about you.
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I pretty much said everything. It's just a mess. It's a confusing film. There's too much in this movie. There's elements that could have worked if it were cut down, but it wasn't. It feels like a disaster to watch. It's jarring. It's terribly paced. And it's bizarre. And none of those things added up to a good movie. I'll give it a Spider-Man 3 out of 10. I don't know. I guess I kind of do recommend it because it is like it's such a weird movie. You almost need to see this movie in its entirety to really believe it. I mean, like you can see those silly scenes on their own, and you probably have, even if you haven't seen the movie, because I know I had. But I don't think that gives you enough. I think seeing them in the context of the full movie makes it even stranger. And so... yeah, so I guess I do recommend it. Anyway, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, and I would oh, dang it. Oh, man. Okay. Well, okay, let me go with this first. I would definitely recommend this. It is a trip to watch. It is so weird and so long and so confusing, and there's so many things going on that it's hard to even keep track of. But I would also give it about like probably right around a 3 as well. Why I was sad there was because I was hoping that I knew the band Train put out a song, like this really edgy song for one of the Spider-Man movies, but unfortunately it was for Spider-Man 2 and not Spider-Man 3.
Damn.
Because, man, that would have just been a perfect way to wrap up our Spider-Man 3 coverage.
Yeah.
But definitely go watch this. It's crazy. And it's on Netflix. It might not be there forever, so watch it while you can, because it's quite a thing.
Okay.
Oh, I will say the suit looks really good. I always thought that about 1, 2, and 3, these Sam Raimi ones. I really like Spider-Man's suit, and I also like the black suit. I think those both look really good.
They do look cool. Okay. Well, then I'll recommend something to you, Steven, if we're good for that.
Yep.
Great. So we have a themed rec coming up because, of course, we're approaching the holidays. So we've got a winter holidays theme. We're going to get very cheery, very merry, very happy, very whatever. It's going to be great. And so, Steven, I'm playing it very, very safe, very basic today. And I'm going to recommend to you the film Miracle on 34th Street. for Christmas time or Hanukkah time or the holidays, whatever time. Okay, yeah, your turn.
Okay, so Lewis, for the holiday I'm choosing, I want to make sure that we recollect and reflect on the most important winter holidays that there are. We celebrate them every year, but I think it's really time to get in the spirit. So for this Toyotathon, Lewis, I'm recommending to you one, the playlist of Toyota commercials for 2019. Make sure you find the Toyotathon ones. There might be only one or two in there. And then I'm also recommending you the Nostalgia Critic video Top 12 Christmas Commercials. Because really, what is Toyotathon other than a commercial holiday?
What is Toyotathon other than Nostalgia Critic?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I want to be clear, and for everyone listening at home, I'm not recommending you Nostalgia Critic. So I'm sure we will talk about the video as it is.
Okay.
But I specifically want you to watch those commercials, and that felt like the best format for you to be able to see them quickly.
Okay. Hey, that just proves the Nostalgia Critic is fair use because I'm going to his video to literally watch copyrighted content. Anyway, okay, great.
Merry Toyotathon, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy Honda days.
And with that, I mean, we're done. That is our final Get Recc'd of 2019. That isn't the winter holidays Get Recc'd, which really doesn't count because the winter holidays are like, you know, not part of the year. I don't know what I'm talking about. Anyway, did you enjoy the show, Steven?
Yeah, so with that, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to try to fit that next episode before the first of the year, so it might still be a 2019 episode.
Yeah.
So look out for that. It will not be before or on Christmas, though, or any of the major holidays. So happy holidays to everyone out there.
Of course.
We hope you have a safe holiday. We hope you have a fun holiday. We hope as you go to bed at night waiting for Krampus to deliver you his podcast presents that you hope you get wrecked again this year, just like we deliver to you every year, straight from Castbox, also known as Krampus.
Mm-hmm. Except I'm sorry to tell you this, you're going to be sorely disappointed because we are not going to deliver you Get Recc'd on time. Santa lied to you. I'm sorry. Don't
But
ask
that's
for
the
Get
real
Recc'd.
world, kids.
Don't ask for Get Recc'd, because if you ask for Get Recc'd, we're gonna have no choice. Santa will literally hold us at gunpoint and force us to release this episode before Christmas, and we're not capable. I ask you, just don't, okay? If on your Christmas list it says Get Recc'd right now, cross it out, erase it, whitewash it, I don't care. I said whitewash, I meant white out. Whatever the case, get that off your page, okay? Because we don't want to die. Certainly not at the hands of Santa. Not on Christmas. Or any holidays, really. I think that would be really upsetting. So, anyway. But yeah, we are in Castbox. That's a thing. Check that in the description. I guess other than that, we're probably done, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, well, I mean, with that, those were our thoughts. Those were our recommendations. Get Recc'd.